on the 415ers podcast, brought to you by the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game. That's Marc Grandi. I'm Evan Giddings. Please download the Odyssey app. Check us out there. Rate, subscribe to us there. The second part of this conversation, Mark, has to do with the national angle of this, which is kind of akin to what Mayoko is saying. And I believe that was from the 49ers Talk, most recent episode of that.
Mm-hmm.
But Greg Cosell on the Ross Tucker podcast, Greg Cosell works with NFL Films, NFL Matchup, but he was on the Ross Tucker podcast, who's an NFL insider for us with Odyssey. Basically, his quote about the situation is, and to Miyoko's point, I don't think that the 49ers have soured on Trey Lance. He's a work in progress, and this is not a work in progress roster. That's where he's coming from. And I think that's pretty fair.
Yeah, no, 100%. The second line there, he's a work in progress, and this is not a work in progress roster. That I 100% agree with. I don't think there's really any room for debate there. Whether you think Trey Lance still has the ability to be a legitimately good quarterback in this league, or you think he's a bust and he's never going to be successful at this level, you agree he's still a work in progress. He's not an elite quarterback by any stretch of the imagination right now. He has to work to get there. So 100% I agree with Greg Cosell there. The question is, and this is where the link to what Mayoko says is, quote, I don't think the 49ers soured on Trey Lance. That's what's a little bit more up in the air and debatable. It's what we've spent so much time this offseason talking about, and we will continue to talk about as the season comes closer, Evan. But Greg Cosell is 100% right. The reason the 49ers, it seems, at least externally, are less willing to play Trey Lance now is because they have a roster that they believe can win the Super Bowl at this very moment, and they have at least what they perceive to be a better option at quarterback, someone who's less of a work in progress, as Greg Cosell put it. So he is correct, 1,000% correct. The 49ers seem to be less willing to start Trey Lance now because he's a work in progress, because their roster is so good. However, I don't immediately believe that that just has to mean that they haven't soured on him. It also could mean that. But the main reason is because of what their roster looks like.
Yes, and I also think that it's kind of a message about how they feel a bit about Darnold or how he perceives their feelings about Darnold, which is whether you think Darnold's a good quarterback or a bad quarterback or somewhere in between. I would lean towards below average, but he is not a work in progress. Like, even though Sam Darnold, I think, is 25 going on 26, he's much more of a established commodity. Like, you can project, I think, what you're going to get from him in that offense far easier than Trey Lance. And Trey Lance's potential is far greater than Sam Darnold, but I do think that there is some comfort in knowing exactly what you're going to get on a week in and week out basis. And if Kyle Shanahan believes that floor of Sam Darnold is good enough to win him games, then I do believe, whether it's ridiculous, that he would feel more comfortable starting him than the question mark that is Trey Lance at this point, that work in progress that is Trey Lance, because as Cosell mentioned, as we're talking about, you can't have a work in progress when you also have Super Bowl aspirations. I don't think that those two are in lockstep with each other. So I think it's kind of talking about how, Brock Purdy is the unknown commodity here more so, or just as much as Trey Lance, but he's the best guy at this point. And then Sam Darnold is the one who's not a work in progress, even if you don't think he should be the dude.
I have a question for you. So obviously, so much of this is what we're talking about right now. So much of this quarterback decision, which again, it seems like is less of a decision. It seems like it's already been made. But so much of this conversation, we'll see. So much of this conversation is about the fact that this is a roster that can win a Super Bowl. So let's say, Evan, the 49ers have the same exact quarterback room, but much, much less talent on the rest of their roster. They're not a legitimate Super Bowl contender. Maybe they can sneak into the playoffs. Maybe they'll be a 5, a 6, whatever, a 5 or 6 seed. They're not going to win their division, most likely. Maybe they can sneak in, but they'll be a big underdog in the first round of the playoffs. Do the 49ers make the same decision at the quarterback room? Meaning, would they start Brock Purdy? Everything else being the same, just the expectations, the talent of this roster not nearly as high. I guess the question really becomes, do they still believe in the upside of Trey Lance? Or do they actually think that Brock Purdy is the long term, much better quarterback moving forward?
I honestly don't think someone like Kyle Shanahan would look at it that way. I think he looks at every single game as winnable. And I think he looks at every single game as needing the best player to help you win that game being out there. So I don't think it changes a whole lot.
I agree.
Um, I don't think if the roster is that far less that he's moving away from Purdy and he's starting Trey Lance. Maybe I guess there's a conversation to be had about who the backup is, or if you even bring Sam Darnold in at all. If you don't think that you're going to be a Final Four-esque team, but no, actually, I don't think much changes at all. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. Which I think I don't know exactly what leads you to that conclusion, but for me, it's because I think, contrary to what Greg Cosell is saying, contrary to what Matt Mayoko is saying, I think it's because they have lost a lot of faith and trust in Trey Lance, and they behind closed doors just simply feel like he was a mistake, a bad pick, and they are ready internally to not give him another chance, to move on. They've seen all that they need in their mind, and they're riding with what they think is the better option, not just now, but in the future. So if you were to take the expectations out of it, I don't think it's a situation where the 49ers are like, all right, well, we're a decent team. We're middle of the pack. If things go right, maybe we make the playoffs. And they start Trey Lance, hoping that as the season progresses, he gets better, and then he jumps Brock Purdy, whatever, I don't know, barrier that is, or wherever he passes him, and they hope, all right, once the postseason comes around, we hope we're a better team with Trey Lance with that development. I don't think that's how they feel about this situation. Now, of course, this is just a wild hypothetical that came to me to throw out there, but everyone is almost kind of hiding behind this is a Super Bowl roster. That's why they're starting the guy with more experience, who played 4 years in college, who flashed more in a small sample size than Lance did in an even smaller sample size. I don't think that's the reason. The reason is just they think Brock Purdy's a better quarterback now and in the future. I don't think this has much to do with the pressure of trying to win a Super Bowl and not relying on the least experienced quarterback to do that.
But I also don't think that means that they believe Trey was a mistake. Like I think it does. I don't think it's about Trey Lance. Quite honestly, like I know he's the center of all of these topics, but I think it is more so about what they believe Brock Purdy to be than what they believe Trey Lance to not be. That's how I read all of this. It's Brock Purdy gives the 49ers the best chance to win football games,
Mhm.
whether it's a win now roster, whether it's a playoff aspiration roster, whether it might even be a bad roster. He is young. He is seemingly the next man up to take over at quarterback for this franchise for the foreseeable future. And until that changes, he's the guy. Like I don't think it's that they don't think Trey Lance is good or that he's a bust or that he stinks. I think it's literally just you got a guy that's better in front of him that you didn't expect to be there. And now you have to recalibrate. Now you have to reevaluate your room. And this is the result of it.
I think I 100% know where you're coming from and understand it. I think it's about Trey Lance only in the sense of how he relates to Brock Purdy. Obviously, it's about Brock Purdy being better, but there comes a certain extent where, I mean, if you're better than someone else, it's related to that someone else's ability. So I do understand what you're saying. I'm probably a little more pessimistic on the 49ers thoughts about Trey Lance than you are, but I would just argue it is about Trey Lance in the sense that it can't be about Brock Purdy being better than Trey Lance without it being about Trey Lance, at least partly.